I'm Olivia Watson, 28, and 8 months pregnant with my first child. When my husband died in a car accident, his family gathered like vultures, whispering that I was just a pregnant widow with nothing. His mother actually laughed when I mentioned staying in our home. "You'll need to find somewhere else, dear. This was always family property." But as I sat in that cold lawyer's office 3 days later, clutching my belly and fighting back tears, the reading of David's will revealed a secret that would change everything, not just for me and my unborn child, but for the family who thought they could erase us both. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt dismissed or underestimated during your most vulnerable moments, like this video because this video is for you. The call came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I remember the exact time because I was lying in bed, rubbing my swollen belly and watching David's side of the bed, waiting for him to come home from his evening jog. He always took the same route through downtown, always wore his reflective vest, always called if he'd be later than usual. The voice on the other end was clinical, professional. "Mrs. Watson? This is Officer Martinez with the city police. There's been an accident involving your husband." My world tilted. The baby kicked hard against my ribs as if sensing my sudden terror. "What kind of accident? Where is he?" "He's been taken to General Hospital." "Ma'am, you should come as soon as possible." I drove through empty streets in my pajamas and David's oversized coat, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grip the steering wheel. The emergency room smelled like disinfectant and fear. A young doctor with kind eyes and terrible news found me in the waiting area. "Mrs. Watson, I'm Dr. Sarah Chan. Your husband was struck by a vehicle while jogging. The impact was severe, and despite our best efforts, I don't remember falling. I don't remember the nurses catching me, or the wheelchair they used to move me to a private room. I remember the twisted metal they showed me later, what remained of the Honda Civic that had veered off the road and into the crosswalk where David had been running. The driver was drunk, they said. 22 years old, already on probation for a previous DUI. That's when David's family arrived. His mother Margaret swept into the hospital room like she owned it. Her perfectly styled silver hair and expensive coat, making me feel even smaller in my pajamas. Behind her came David's older brother Robert and his sister Janet, both dressed as if they'd been at some social event rather than rushing to a family emergency. "Oh, David," Margaret wailed dramatically, though I noticed her makeup remained perfectly intact. "My poor boy." She didn't look at me once. Robert's wife Sarah whispered something about "that pregnant girl," as if I couldn't hear her. Janet clutched the childhood photo of David one I'd never seen before and shot me a look that seemed to blame me for his death. They clustered around the doctor, asking questions about arrangements, about David's belongings, about next steps. As if I didn't exist. As if I weren't his wife, weren't carrying his child, weren't the one who should be making these decisions. "Excuse me," I finally managed, my voice hoarse from crying. "I need to know about the arrangements for my husband." Margaret turned to me with cold eyes. "David may have married you, dear, but he's our blood. We'll handle everything from here." The baby kicked again, harder this time, and I placed both hands on my belly protectively. That's when I noticed Margaret's gaze drop to David's grandmother's ring on my finger, the antique sapphire and diamond set he'd given me for our engagement. "That ring," she said quietly, "has been in our family for 3 generations." I twisted it unconsciously, the metal warm against my skin. David had told me his grandmother wanted him to give it to the woman he truly loved. That it was meant for his wife, for the mother of his children. "David gave it to me," I whispered. "David gave you many things he shouldn't have," Robert interjected, his voice sharp. "But blood is blood. That ring belongs with family." I looked around the sterile hospital room, at these people who shared David's DNA, but had never shown him or me anything resembling love. The weight of my grief pressed down like a physical thing, making it hard to breathe. "I am family," I said, but my voice was so quiet I wasn't sure anyone heard. They continued planning around me, as if I were furniture to be moved later. As if David's life, our life, was just another asset to be divided among his rightful heirs. David's funeral was held at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, an imposing stone building where the Watson family had attended services for decades. I sat in the front pew, my black maternity dress straining across my belly, feeling like an intruder at my own husband's memorial service. Margaret clutched David's childhood photo throughout the entire ceremony, a picture of him at age 7, gap-toothed, and grinning in a Little League uniform. She'd positioned herself strategically so that everyone could see it, as if claiming ownership of his memory. Every time someone approached to offer condolences, she'd show them the photo and launch into stories of David's childhood that excluded me entirely. "He was such a sweet boy," she'd say, dabbing at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, "always so devoted to his family. We were everything to him." The pastor, who had never met David, delivered a generic eulogy based on notes Margaret had provided. He spoke of David's love for his family, his successful career, his bright future that had been cut short. He mentioned his surviving relatives, but never once said the word wife. When I tried to stand to speak, Margaret's hand shot out and gripped my wrist. "Perhaps it's better if you don't, dear," she whispered. "You're quite emotional, and we want to remember David properly." I sank back into the pew, my face burning with humiliation. Around me, family, friends, and distant relatives nodded approvingly at Margaret's wisdom. No one asked about my memories of David. No one wanted to hear about the man who sang off-key in the shower, who read pregnancy books cover to cover, who talked to my belly every night about his dreams for our baby after the service. The family formed a receiving line without including me. I stood awkwardly to the side, watching Robert and Janet accept condolences while Margaret continued her performance with the childhood photo. When David's college roommate Mike approached me with genuine sympathy, Robert quickly intercepted him. "Thanks for coming, Mike. Mom's handling the family receiving line if you'd like to pay your respects." Mike looked confused, glancing between Robert and me, "But Olivia, she's David's wife." "Of course," Robert said smoothly. "But she's quite overwhelmed, as you can imagine. Pregnancy and grief, you know. We're trying to protect her from too much stress." The dismissal was clear. Mike squeezed my hand apologetically and moved on. At the burial, I stood apart from the family cluster around the grave. The October wind whipped through the cemetery, and I pulled David's coat tighter around my shoulders. It still smelled like his cologne, and the familiar scent made fresh tears spill down my cheeks. Janet noticed the coat and frowned. "Is that David's jacket?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "That's a Burberry," she said pointedly. "Cost over $1,000. I'm sure he wouldn't have wanted it ruined." Before I could respond, she was already moving toward me with her hand extended, as if I would simply hand over my dead husband's coat in the middle of his burial. I stepped back instinctively, my hand going to my belly. "I think I'll keep it," I said quietly. Margaret's head snapped up from where she'd been laying flowers. "Janet's right, dear. You should be more careful with David's things. They're all we have left of him now." The implication hung in the air like smoke. I was temporary, replaceable. The baby and I were just complications to be managed, obstacles to be moved aside so the real family could grieve properly. As they lowered David's casket into the ground, I realized I was truly alone. These people, who shared his blood, his name, his history, they had no intention of sharing his memory with me. In their eyes, I was just the pregnant widow with nothing. Soon, I would have no claim on any part of David's life. Standing there in that windswept cemetery, watching dirt fall onto my husband's coffin while his family planned around me, I made a silent promise to the baby growing inside me. Whatever happened, I would make sure our child knew who David really was. Not the sanitized version Margaret was already crafting, that the real man who had loved us both fiercely, they came to the house 3 days after the funeral, arriving like they owned the place. I was sitting in David's study, surrounded by sympathy cards and trying to figure out what bills needed immediate attention, when I heard multiple car doors slamming in the driveway. Through the window I watched Margaret, Robert, and Janet emerge. From Robert's BMW, their faces set with purpose. Margaret carried a large purse and what looked like a folder of documents. My stomach dropped. I didn't have time to compose myself before the doorbell rang. When I opened it, Margaret pushed past me without invitation. "We need to talk, Olivia," she announced, settling herself on my living room sofa as if she belonged. There, Robert and Janet flanked her like bodyguards. "Of course," I said carefully, remaining standing. "What about?" Margaret opened her purse and withdrew a set of keys I recognized immediately. They were David's spares, the ones he'd given his mother years ago for emergencies. She held them up like evidence in a trial. "These house keys," she said. "I think there's been some confusion about the living arrangements." My heart started pounding. "I'm sorry," Robert leaned forward. "Olivia, we understand this is difficult, but we need to discuss practicalities. This house, it's not actually yours." The room seemed to tilt. "What do you mean? This is my home. David and I bought it together, actually," Janet interrupted, pulling out a folder. "We've looked into the deed situation. The house is in David's name only, which means it's part of his estate." I stared at them, my hand instinctively going to my belly. "But we're married. I live here. We built our life here." Margaret's voice took on a patronizing tone, the way you'd speak to a confused child. "Dear, I know you're emotional, but you need to understand reality. David may have let you play house here, but blood is blood. This property has been in our family's financial planning for years." "David never mentioned." "David was young," Robert said firmly. "He made impulsive decisions. The marriage, the pregnancy, it all happened so fast. But family assets need to be protected for actual family members." I felt like I was drowning. "I am family. I'm his wife. I'm carrying his child." Margaret actually laughed, a cold sound that made my skin crawl. "You're carrying a child, yes. But genetics are what matter. That baby will have Watson blood, but you're just the vessel." The cruelty of it took my breath away. Janet continued as if her mother hadn't just dehumanized me completely. "We've spoken to Olivia," she said, consulting her papers. "Since the house is solely in David's name and there's no will specifying otherwise, it becomes part of his estate. As his blood relatives, we have legitimate claims." "But surely there are spousal rights." "Limited," Robert cut me off. "Especially for such a short marriage. What was it? 18 months. And most of that you've been pregnant and not contributing financially." I wanted to scream that I'd been working full-time until my doctor ordered bed rest just 2 weeks ago. That I'd contributed to every mortgage payment, every utility bill, every grocery receipt. But looking at their faces, I realized facts didn't matter to them. Margaret stood and walked to the mantelpiece, where David and I had displayed our wedding photos and ultrasound pictures. She picked up our wedding photo and studied it with distaste. "This whole situation is unfortunate," she said. "David was always too soft-hearted, too willing to help strays." The word strays hit me like a slap. I was a stray to them, not a woman who had loved their son, not the mother of their grandchild, but something David had foolishly taken in. "I think you should start looking for other arrangements," Margaret continued, setting down the photo without looking at me. "Somewhere more appropriate for your situation. A small apartment, perhaps. Something you can actually afford on your own." "This is my home," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "I'm not leaving." The three of them exchanged glances. Robert stood up, and for a moment I was reminded of how much bigger he was than David had been, how much more intimidating. "Olivia," he said, his voice carrying a warning, "you don't want to make this difficult. We're trying to be reasonable here, considering your condition." But don't mistake our consideration for weakness. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Janet said sweetly, that we have resources you don't, lawyers you can't afford, time you don't have. Her eyes dropped meaningfully to my belly. A baby changes everything, doesn't it? You'll need to think about what's best for the child. The threat was clear. Fight them, and they'd make sure I had nothing. No home, no security, no way to provide for David's baby. Margaret placed the keys on the coffee table with a decisive click. These belong to the family now. We'll be reasonable about timing. You have until the end of the month to make other arrangements. That should give you plenty of time to find something suitable. They gathered their things and headed for the door, leaving me standing in my own living room feeling like the intruder. At the threshold, Margaret turned back. Oh, and Olivia? You might want to start thinking about other things that belong to the family. David's personal items, family heirlooms, that sort of thing. We'll need to discuss those as well. After they left, I sank onto the sofa and stared at the keys sitting on my coffee table. Keys to my own home, held hostage by people who saw me, as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. I looked around the living room where David and I had planned our future, where we'd assembled the crib that now waited upstairs, where we dreamed about raising our child. In 3 weeks, if they had their way, it would all be gone, but something deep inside me, some fierce maternal instinct that was growing stronger every day, refused to accept defeat. I might be alone, I might be pregnant and grieving and overwhelmed, but I wasn't going down without a fight. David had loved me. David had chosen me. And somewhere in the legal maze ahead, there had to be a way to honor that choice. The attacks on my marriage began the very next morning. Janet showed up alone this time, carrying coffee and wearing the kind of sympathetic expression that immediately put me on guard. I brought you some chamomile tea, she said, settling herself at my kitchen table uninvited. Caffeine isn't good for the baby. I accepted the tea warily, noting how she watched my every move. Thank you. I've been thinking about our conversation. Yesterday, she began, her tone deceptively casual. About David and his impulsive decisions. It made me remember some things that seemed odd at the time. I waited, my hands wrapped around the warm mug. Your wedding, for instance, Janet continued. It was all so rushed, wasn't it? David barely knew you 6 months before you were engaged. We knew what we wanted, I said quietly. Did you? Janet tilted her head. Because I remember David seemed almost frantic about it, talking about getting married right away, not wanting to wait for a proper engagement period, almost like he felt pressured. The implication hung in the air like poison. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. David wasn't pressured into anything. Of course not consciously, Janet said, her voice dripping with false understanding. But you have to admit, the timing was convenient. You got pregnant so quickly after meeting him. I set down my tea with a sharp clink. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Janet said innocently. I'm just saying that from the outside, it looked like classic entrapment. Sweet, naive David meets a woman who sees $signs. Stop. My voice came out harder than I'd ever heard it. Just stop. But Janet continued as if I hadn't spoken. He was always too trusting, too generous. Remember in college when he kept lending money to that roommate who never paid him back? David couldn't see when people were using him. She reached into her purse and pulled out my marriage certificate somehow. They'd gotten a copy. The official document looked stark and clinical under the kitchen fluorescent lights. 18 months, Janet mused, running her finger along the date, from meeting to marriage to pregnancy to widowhood. That's quite a timeline. I stared at the certificate, remembering the joy on David's face at City Hall. How he'd insisted. We needed witnesses, so he'd asked 2 strangers in the hallway to sign for us. How he'd kissed me afterward and said he'd never been happier. David loved me, I whispered. I'm sure he thought he did, Janet agreed. That love and manipulation can look very similar to the person being manipulated. She leaned forward conspiratorially. Can I ask you something, woman to woman? Did you plan the pregnancy? The question hit me like a physical blow. How dare you? I'm not judging, Janet said quickly. I understand desperation. You were 26, probably feeling your biological clock ticking, working a nothing job at that insurance office. Then you meet David at that coffee shop, successful, lonely, generous David. I can see how the temptation would be overwhelming. My mind flashed back to that first meeting. I'd been having a terrible day, dealing with a difficult client, and had spilled coffee all over my papers at the cafe. David had appeared with napkins and a kind smile, helping me clean up the mess. We talked for 2 hours about books and travel and dreams for the future. It wasn't like that, I said, but my voice sounded weak even to me. Wasn't it? Janet studied my face carefully. Because I've been doing some research, Olivia. Your financial situation before you met David was pretty dire, wasn't it? Behind on rent, credit cards maxed out, student loans in default. I stared at her, horrified. You investigated me. We had to protect David's interests, Janet said matter-of-factly. And what we found was a woman in serious financial trouble who suddenly found herself a very convenient solution. She pulled out more papers, copies of my credit reports, bank statements, employment records. The invasion of privacy was breathtaking, but what terrified me more was how it would look to an outsider. A struggling woman meets a wealthy man, and suddenly all her problems disappear. The pregnancy came at exactly the right time, didn't it? Janet continued relentlessly. Right when David might have started seeing through the act. A baby was perfect insurance, something to tie him to you permanently. I wanted to scream that it hadn't been planned, that we'd been careless exactly once, that David had been over the moon about the pregnancy. But looking at the evidence laid out on my kitchen table, I could see how someone could construct a different narrative. David was excited about the baby, I managed. Of course he was, Janet said. David always wanted to be a father. You gave him exactly what he'd always dreamed of. Very clever. She began gathering up the papers, her point made. The thing is, Olivia, none of this would matter if David was still alive, but he's not. And now we have to deal with the consequences of his poor judgment. At the door, she paused. You know, if you'd really loved David, you would have wanted what was best for him. You would have encouraged him to maintain his relationship with his family, instead of driving a wedge between us. After she left, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the wreckage of my reputation. Every memory of my relationship with David was now tainted by her poisonous suggestions. Had I been subconsciously manipulative? Had my financial desperation influenced my feelings more than I'd admitted to myself? I thought about how David had gradually stopped mentioning his family, how he'd seemed relieved when I didn't push to meet them right away. I'd assumed he was protecting me from their judgment. Now I wondered if he'd been protecting them from something else. The worst part was that somewhere, buried beneath my anger and hurt, a tiny voice wondered if Janet might be right. Had I been so desperate for security that I'd unconsciously manipulated a kind man into saving me? I placed my hands on my belly and felt the baby respond with a gentle flutter. Whatever mistakes I might have made, whatever the family wanted to believe about my motivations, this child was real. David's love for both of us had been real, but as I sat alone in the house they wanted to take from me, I realized that my word against theirs wouldn't be enough. They had resources, lawyers, and a narrative that painted me as a calculating gold digger who had trapped their beloved. David, I had only the truth, and sometimes the truth wasn't enough. The call came Thursday morning while I was trying to keep down toast, my morning sickness worsened by stress. Mrs. Watson, this is James Morrison from Morrison & Associates. I was your husband's attorney. I gripped the phone. I'm sorry, who? James Morrison. I handled David's legal affairs. We need to schedule a reading of his will. My heart stopped. His will? The family said David didn't have a will. A pause. Mrs. Watson, David executed a comprehensive will 8 months ago. You're listed as the primary beneficiary. The room spun. I don't understand. Can you come tomorrow at 2 p.m.? I've contacted the other interested parties. After hanging up, my phone rang immediately. Margaret's voice was tight with anger. Olivia, dear, I just received a confusing call from some lawyer claiming David had a will. James Morrison called me too, I said carefully. This is obviously a mistake. David would never make a will without telling his family, but I could hear uncertainty creeping into her voice. He wants us all there tomorrow at 2 p.m., I told her. This is some kind of scam, Robert's voice came from the background. Then you have nothing to worry about by attending, I said, surprising myself. Margaret's voice turned ice cold. Fine, we'll clear up this confusion, but don't get your hopes up, dear. Blood is still blood. That evening I searched David's study with new eyes. Hidden behind his college transcripts, I found Morrison's business card. On the back, in David's handwriting, a date from 8 months ago and final draft approved. 8 months ago. Right when I told him about the pregnancy, I remembered how David had seemed anxious then, asking strange questions about my family, our future, his family's wealth. I thought he was nervous about becoming a father. Now I wondered if he'd been making secret preparations. The small white appointment card sat on the desk like a lottery ticket. Everything could change tomorrow: the house, the family's claims, my entire future. I placed my hand on my belly as the baby moved restlessly. Whatever happens tomorrow, I whispered, we'll face it together. I arrived at Morrison & Associates. 30 minutes early, hands shaking as I signed in. The Watson family was already there when I entered the conference room. Behind them hung an old family portrait I'd never seen, and suddenly everything made sense. The painting showed the Watson family from 30 years ago, but in the background was the Watson Industries logo, the same one I'd seen on office buildings downtown. That's David's grandfather, Margaret said, noticing my stare. He built Watson Industries from nothing. 3 generations of Watson men ran that company. I stared, mind-reeling. David never mentioned. David was supposed to take over when his father died, Robert interrupted. Instead, he walked away, broke his father's heart. Too soft for business, Janet added. Too concerned with ethics and worker rights. Father groomed him for 10 years and David abandoned everything. James Morrison entered carrying a thick folder. He was younger than expected, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Thank you all for coming, he said. Mr. Morrison, Margaret began imperiously. There's been confusion. David never mentioned having a will. Morrison's eyebrows rose. Mrs. Watson, your son and I worked on his estate planning for several months. He was very thorough. Impossible, Robert said. David would have discussed this with family. Actually, David was specific that the family not be informed until after his death. He felt it would cause conflict. Morrison spread documents across the table: bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds. The numbers made my head spin. David inherited a substantial trust fund at 25, Morrison explained. Additionally, he retained significant shares in Watson Industries despite stepping down. Janet grabbed a bank statement. I've never seen these accounts. David maintained separate finances. He was concerned about independence. Margaret's voice was barely controlled. How much? Morrison consulted his notes. David's personal estate was valued at approximately $12 million. Silence. I couldn't breathe. $12 million. And he was living in that modest house, driving a Honda, Robert said slowly. David chose to live simply, Morrison replied. He didn't want wealth to define his relationships. Margaret's laugh was bitter. So he chose to complicate relationships by marrying a stranger and keeping secrets from his blood. Morrison's gaze settled on me warmly. David spoke about you often, Mrs. Watson. He wanted to protect you and your child from exactly this conflict. David's secrecy suddenly made sense. He hadn't been hiding wealth from me. He'd been hiding our relationship from his wealth. Morrison opened another folder and spread out. More documents, bank statements I'd never seen. Charitable donation records that made my heart ache. Mrs. Watson should understand her husband's full financial activities. Morrison said. He handed me bank statements with David's name. Monthly deposits, careful investments, regular withdrawals to various charities. The Children's Hospital Foundation. I read aloud. St. Mary's Food Bank. These donations are in my name. David set up charitable giving a year ago, Morrison explained. He wanted to support causes that mattered to you. Margaret snatched the statements. David never cared about charity before he met her. David said meeting Olivia inspired him to give back, Morrison replied. I remembered those conversations, casual, mentions of places I'd volunteered. David had listened so carefully. Monthly donations total nearly $50,000 annually, Morrison continued, all in Olivia's name. Robert's face reddened. $50,000 a year? Janet grabbed another document. These numbers are huge. David's investment portfolio. He was quite astute about financial planning. I stared at numbers that seemed abstract. David had been building our future while I worried about groceries. Why didn't he tell me? I whispered. Morrison's expression softened. David wanted to protect your relationship's authenticity. He wanted to be sure you loved him for who he was. Another document caught my eye: life insurance I'd never heard of. $5 million with my name and baby Watson as beneficiaries. He took out the policy after learning about the pregnancy, Morrison explained. David had known something could happen. While I'd been planning nursery colors, he'd been building financial fortresses to protect us. Robert studied property deeds. He owned rental properties downtown. The rental income generates $30,000 monthly, all going into trust accounts for the baby. Margaret stood abruptly. David was mentally unstable to hide this from blood relatives. David was completely competent, Morrison said firmly. He underwent psychological evaluation 6 months ago. He anticipated challenges and prepared accordingly. As I sat surrounded by evidence of David's secret empire, I felt awe mixed with betrayal. He'd loved me enough to build this future but had lied about who he really was every single day. The modest consultant I'd married had never existed. In his place was someone far more complex, a millionaire who'd chosen simplicity. A strategic planner who'd anticipated his own death. Morrison returned documents to folders and reached for the sealed envelope that had sat untouched in the tables. Center, the cream-colored envelope bore David's name in elegant script, with last will and testament. Below. The tension was suffocating. Margaret sat rigidly, hands clenched. Robert drummed fingers nervously, while Janet glanced between the envelope and me with hostility. My heart pounded so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. Before I open this, Morrison said solemnly, David spent considerable time crafting these provisions. He consulted multiple attorneys, reviewed various scenarios, and made decisions, deliberately. These represent his final wishes and have been structured to withstand legal challenges. Margaret's voice was ice cold. Are you suggesting we might challenge our son's will? I'm suggesting David was aware of potential family conflicts and planned accordingly. Morrison replied diplomatically. Robert leaned forward aggressively. What exactly did David tell you about his family? Morrison chose words carefully. David felt his family viewed him primarily as a financial source, rather than an individual with his own life and choices. He was concerned wealth might overshadow personal relationships. That's ridiculous, Janet protested. We loved David, which is what David wanted to provide for his wife and child, Morrison said smoothly. His definition of what was best simply differed from yours. I watched the family's confidence crack. They'd been certain blood would triumph, that David's wealth would automatically flow to biological relatives. Now doubt was creeping in. Morrison carefully opened the envelope and withdrew a thick document bound in blue legal backing. He set it down with ceremonial gravity. David's will is comprehensive, Morrison explained. It includes specific provisions for various scenarios, detailed explanations of his reasoning, and clear distribution instructions. Margaret's hands trembled slightly. Just read it, please. The will is dated 8 months ago and was witnessed by 2 of my partners. David also recorded a video statement explaining his decisions, which we can view afterward if desired. Video statement. Even in death, David was trying to explain himself. David also included personal letters for each of you, Morrison added, indicating sealed envelopes. These will be distributed after the legal reading. Janet's voice was barely a whisper. He wrote us letters. David wanted you to understand his perspective, Morrison said gently. He hoped you might eventually see his decisions as acts of love rather than betrayal. Morrison adjusted his glasses. I, David Michael Watson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. I placed both hands on my belly, feeling the baby move restlessly. Please, I whispered. Continue. Morrison turned to page 3 and began reading the specific bequests. To my beloved mother, Margaret Watson, I leave the family home at 1247 Elm Street, along with all family photographs, heirlooms, and personal items from my childhood. Margaret's face showed the first hint of relief. To my brother Robert Watson, I leave my shares in Watson Industries, valued at approximately $2.8 million, with the provision that these shares cannot be sold for 10 years. Robert's eyes widened. $2.8 million was substantial. To my sister Janet Watson, I leave my commercial real estate portfolio, consisting of 4 downtown properties, valued at approximately $1.5 million. The family was receiving nearly $5 million between them. The tension eased slightly, but Morrison turned the page. However, these bequests come with specific conditions. Relief transformed back into apprehension. The family home is bequeathed to my mother with the provision that she welcome my wife Olivia and our child as family members. Should my mother choose to exclude or mistreat my wife and child, the property will be transferred to a charitable trust. Margaret's face went white. He can't do that. The Watson Industries shares require that Robert treat my wife with respect. Due to a family member, any attempts to contest this will or harass my wife will result in immediate transfer of these shares to the David Watson Foundation for Economic Justice. Robert's mouth fell open. This is extortion. The commercial real estate portfolio requires that Janet maintain a civil and supportive relationship with my wife and child. Failure to do so will result in the properties being sold and proceeds donated to women's shelters. Janet's voice was shrill. David's trying to force us to pretend we like her. Morrison flipped to another page, revealing more property deeds. In addition to the specific family bequests, I own the following properties that were not disclosed to my family during my lifetime. He began listing addresses, rental properties, commercial buildings, undeveloped land. The scope of David's hidden real estate empire was staggering. The total value of these additional holdings is approximately $4.2 million. Morrison announced. Margaret gripped the table's edge. $4 million in properties we never knew about. Robert studied the deeds with growing alarm. These are major commercial properties. The question now, Morrison said, is what David chose to do with the remaining $7 million of his estate. The silence was deafening. After giving the family nearly $5 million in conditional bequests, David still had $7 million to distribute. Morrison turned to the final section of the will, his voice steady despite the electric tension. Remainder of my estate, totaling approximately $7 million. I leave entirely to my beloved wife, Olivia Watson, and our unborn child. The words hit like a thunderclap. Margaret gasped. Janet's face went white. Robert stood so quickly. His chair scraped the floor. That's impossible, Margaret whispered. Morrison continued. This includes all remaining liquid assets, investment accounts, the family home we purchased together, and a trust fund for our child's education. My hands shook against my belly. $7 million. Furthermore, I am establishing the Olivia Watson Foundation with an initial endowment of $2 million to be managed by my wife for charitable purposes. Robert's voice was strangled. This is insane. She was married to him for 18 months. Additionally, I leave to Olivia my personal letter collection, including all correspondence with my family, so she may understand the full context of our relationship dynamics. Morrison set down the will. There are also protective provisions. Any legal challenges to this will result in immediate revocation of all family bequests, with those funds transferring to Olivia's foundation. Margaret's voice was barely audible. He's cut us out, for her. David was very clear about his priorities, Morrison said gently. Janet began crying tears of rage and disbelief. $7 million to someone who trapped him. Actually, Morrison pulled out another document. David began drafting this will before learning about the pregnancy. The child's provisions were added later. The sealed will amendment was final proof. David had chosen me before he knew about our baby. Robert slammed his hand on the table. We'll contest this. No court will let some gold digger steal a family fortune. Morrison remained calm. Any legal challenges result in forfeiture of your bequests. David was quite specific. Margaret stared at me with pure hatred. You did this. You poisoned him against his family. I found my voice. I didn't even know he had money. Convenient, Janet spat. Morrison cleared his throat. David left video messages for each of you, explaining his decisions. Would you like to watch them now? No, Margaret stood abruptly, clutching her purse. I've heard enough. But as they gathered to leave, I saw the calculation in their eyes. $5 million in conditional bequests versus losing everything by fighting me. David had known them better than they'd known themselves. Margaret clutched her purse like a lifeline as her world crumbled. Her carefully maintained composure had shattered, leaving behind a woman who looked suddenly old and fragile. This can't be legal, she whispered. David was our son, our blood. She's nobody, just some woman who stole him away. Robert paced behind her chair, face red with fury. There has to be something we can do. Undue influence, mental incapacity, fraud, something. The psychological evaluation rules out mental incapacity, Morrison said calmly, and David's documentation shows this was entirely his decision. Janet's tears had turned to bitter laughter. So that's it. 18 months of marriage trumps 30 years of family. She gets $7 million for being pregnant. She gets $7 million for being the person David chose to love, Morrison corrected gently. Margaret's voice rose to a near shriek. Love? She manipulated a grieving man who'd lost his father. I felt the baby kick hard. David wasn't grieving when we met, I said quietly. Your husband died 3 years before I knew David existed. Don't you dare mention my husband, Margaret snapped. You don't know anything about this family. I know David felt like an outsider in his own family, I said, voice growing stronger. I know he was tired of being seen as a bank account instead of a person. Robert leaned over the table aggressively. You turned him against us. Filled his head with lies. I never said a word against any of you, I replied. David formed his own opinions based on how you treated him and me. Janet wiped her eyes, smearing mascara. We were protecting him. We knew you were trouble. You met me exactly twice, I said. Once at dinner where you talked about people I didn't know, and once at Christmas where everyone got expensive gifts except me. I got a drugstore candle. Morrison cleared his throat. Perhaps we should focus on practical aspects of the will's execution. But Margaret wasn't done. I want to see those video messages. I want to hear David explain how he could betray his own mother. Morrison hesitated, then reached for his laptop. Very well. But David was quite direct. As the video loaded, I saw David's face. My David, recorded months ago in this office. He looked tired but determined. Mum, David's voice filled the room and Margaret immediately began crying. If you're watching this, it means I'm gone, and you're upset about my will. I need you to understand, I didn't choose Olivia over you. I chose love over obligation. Margaret's sobs grew louder. You never accepted her. You never even tried. And that told me everything I needed to know about what you really thought of me. The video ended, leaving devastating silence. Margaret looked at me with something that might have been understanding or hatred. "He's really gone," she whispered. "And he chose you." After the family left, Morrison handed me a sealed envelope with my name in David's familiar handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. "My dearest Olivia," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then my worst fears have come true, and I'm no longer there to protect you from my family's cruelty. I'm sorry for the secrets I kept, but I hope you understand why they were necessary." I could hear David's voice as I read, explaining the history I'd never known. My family sees relationships as transactions. Love to them is conditional on usefulness. When I walked away from the business, I became a disappointment. When I married you instead of someone they chose, I became a traitor. They will try to make you believe I was weak, that you manipulated me. But the truth is simpler. You were the first person who loved me for who I was, not what I could provide. The letter detailed years of emotional manipulation David had endured. How his father had threatened disownment if he didn't take over the business. How his mother had bribed his college girlfriend to break up with him. How Robert and Janet had always seen him as their financial security, rather than their brother. I kept my wealth secret because I needed to know what we had was real. I'd seen too many relationships poisoned by money. When you fell in love with David, the consultant who worried about mortgage payments, I knew I'd found something genuine. David had planned to tell me about the money after the baby was born. He'd already set up college funds and trust accounts. He'd dreamed of us traveling the world, showing our children that wealth was a tool for good. "The provisions in my will are not punishments," he wrote. "They're opportunities. My family can choose love over greed, acceptance over resentment. If they do, they'll be rewarded with financial security and the chance to know their grandchild. If they don't, they'll lose everything." The letter's final paragraph broke my heart. "Please don't let their bitterness poison your memories of us. What we had was beautiful and real. Raise our child to understand that family is about love, not blood. Teach them that wealth is a responsibility, not a right. And remember that every choice I made was because I loved you both more than life itself." He'd signed it simply, "Forever yours, David." Morrison returned quietly and placed a small box on the table. Inside was a key. "David purchased a house," he said gently. "Somewhere his family doesn't know about. He wanted you to have a safe place to start over." I looked at the key, my key to freedom, and felt David's love surrounding me like a shield. Even in death, he was still taking care of us. For the first time since the accident, I felt hope. 2 weeks later, the legal challenges began. The contest filing papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a stern-faced process server who apologized for disturbing a pregnant widow. The accusations were clear: undue influence, mental incapacity, fraud, and conspiracy. They claimed David had been mentally unstable when he made the will, that I had isolated him from his family and manipulated his grief, that the pregnancy was a deliberate trap, that I had somehow coerced him into the psychological evaluation Morrison called within hours. "I expected this," he said calmly. "David did too. Are you prepared for what comes next?" "What comes next?" "They're going to try to destroy your reputation, dig into your past, question your motives, paint you as a calculating gold digger. They'll make this as ugly as possible." The media attention started immediately. "Pregnant widow inherits millions," screamed headlines. "Family fights gold digger." CLAMS, read another. Details of the will had leaked, and suddenly my private grief was public entertainment. Reporters camped outside the house. David had left me a beautiful colonial in a quiet suburb. They shouted questions when I left for doctor's appointments, took pictures of my growing belly, speculated about my motives. The family's lawyer, Patricia Hawkins, gave interviews painting me as a master manipulator who had seduced a vulnerable man. She pointed to my financial troubles before meeting David as evidence of gold digging. She questioned the timing of our marriage and pregnancy as suspiciously convenient, but Morrison was ready for every attack. He released David's psychological evaluation, showing perfect mental competency. He provided evidence of David's careful planning and multiple will revisions over several months. He shared documentation of the family's hostile treatment of me, including recorded voicemails where Robert had threatened to make me pay. The most damaging evidence came from David himself. Morrison released portions of video messages where David explicitly stated that his family's treatment of me had influenced his decision. They never accepted her, David said on camera. They made it clear from day one that she wasn't good enough for our family. Well, she's good enough for me. She's everything to me. Public opinion began shifting. The story transformed from gold digger steals fortune to family rejects son's wife. Loses inheritance. Social media rallied around me, a pregnant widow being harassed by greedy in-laws. That the stress was taking its toll. My blood pressure spiked during a brutal deposition where Hawkins grilled me for 6 hours about every conversation with David about money. My doctor ordered bed rest. Late at night, alone in David's secret house, I wondered if fighting was worth it. Maybe I should take whatever settlement they offered and disappear. Then I'd feel the baby kick. And I'd remember David's letter. This wasn't just about money. It was about proving that love was stronger than blood. Morrison's counterattack was swift and devastating. David's medical records from his final months showed a man in perfect mental health, regular checkups, normal blood work, even a psychiatric evaluation done specifically for estate planning. David was exceptionally thorough, Morrison explained during our strategy meeting. He anticipated every possible challenge. But the most powerful evidence was David's own words. Morrison had been recording their estate planning sessions, with David's permission, creating an audio trail of his decision-making process. I want to be crystal clear, David's voice played in the conference room, recorded 6 months before his death. My family will claim I'm not thinking straight, that Olivia has manipulated me, but I've never been more certain of anything. She's the best thing that ever happened to me. Hawkins tried arguing the recordings were doctored, but audio analysis confirmed authenticity. She claimed David was depressed, but medical records showed no mental illness. She suggested I had drugged him, but security footage from Morrison's office showed David arriving alone, alert, and in control. The family's case crumbled when Morrison revealed their financial troubles. Robert's business was failing, hemorrhaging money for 2 years. Janet was behind on mortgage payments, facing foreclosure. Margaret had been quietly liquidating assets to maintain her lifestyle. They weren't protecting David, Morrison told the judge. They were protecting their expected inheritance. David's marriage threatened their financial security. The revelation that stunned everyone came when Morrison produced David's private correspondence with his family. Email after email showed their increasing hostility toward me. Their demands that David reconsider his marriage. Their threats to cut him off. One email from Margaret was particularly damning. That woman is going to ruin everything we've worked for. If you don't get rid of her soon, you'll lose more than family, you'll lose your inheritance too. David's response was equally revealing. Mum, if you can't accept my wife, then maybe it's time I made other arrangements for my estate. The threat had been mutual. The family had tried to manipulate David with money, and he'd responded by removing them from his will, entirely only adding them back with conditions designed to force better behavior. Hawkins made one final desperate argument that David's conditions proved he was being manipulated by me to turn against his blood relatives. Morrison's response was brilliant. He called Margaret to the stand and asked a simple question. Mrs. Watson, if you had to choose between $5 million and your hatred of Olivia, which would you choose? Margaret's answer destroyed their case. I choose my family's money. Not her family. Not her love for David. Her family's money. The judge's ruling was swift and comprehensive. David's will was upheld entirely. The family's contest was deemed frivolous and filed in bad faith. All legal fees would be paid from their INAERITANCEs. As we left the courthouse, Margaret caught my arm. For a moment, I thought she might apologize. Instead, she whispered, "You may have won his money, but you'll never have what we had. You'll never be family." I looked at this bitter woman who had chosen greed over love and realized she was wrong. I already had more family than she'd ever understand. 3 months later, they came crawling back. Margaret appeared at my door with Janet in tow, both looking haggard and desperate. I was visibly 9 months pregnant now, my belly enormous as I approached my due date. "Olivia," Margaret said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "We need to talk." I let them in reluctantly, one hand supporting my aching back. They sat stiffly on the couch David had chosen, looking around at the home he'd secretly bought for us. "We've been thinking," Janet began hesitantly, "about the conditions in David's will." I waited, saying nothing. Margaret pulled out a baby's ultrasound photo, my baby's ultrasound photo, somehow acquired from their lawyer's discovery materials. She stared at it with tears in her eyes. "This is David's child," she whispered. "Our grandchild. Our nephew. Your point?" I asked. "We want to be part of his life," Janet said quickly. "We want to meet him, to be his family." "You called me a gold digger," I reminded them. "You tried to take away everything David left us." Margaret's composure finally cracked completely. "We were wrong," she sobbed. "We were scared and angry, and we took it out on you. But this baby, he's all we have left of David." I felt my own tears threatening. "David is gone because of a drunk driver, not because of me. But you blamed me anyway." "We know," Janet said quietly. "We know we failed him. Failed you. But please don't let our mistakes cost this child his family." I looked at these broken women who had tormented me, who had tried to steal my future, who were now begging for scraps of connection to the grandson they'd almost lost forever. "David left you conditions for a reason," I said finally. "He wanted you to choose between money and family. What's your choice?" Margaret looked me directly in the eyes for the first time since David's death. "We choose family," she said. "We choose you." But as I studied their faces, I wondered if desperation looked the same as sincerity. The baby kicked hard against my ribs, as if weighing in on their fate. "We'll see," I said. Baby David was born on a snowy Tuesday morning in December, exactly 2 weeks before his first Christmas. He was perfect 10 fingers, 10 toes, and David's dark hair that stuck up in impossible directions. Margaret and Janet had been haunting the hospital waiting room for 3 days, ever since my water broke. When the nurse finally let them in, to meet their grandson, Margaret broke down completely. "He looks just like David did," she whispered, touching his tiny fingers with shaking hands. "Same nose, same stubborn chin." I watched her hold my son, their grandson, and saw something I'd never seen before in Margaret's face. Genuine love without conditions attached. "What's his name?" Janet asked softly. "David James Watson," I said. "James for his grandfather." Margaret's eyes filled with fresh tears. David would have loved that. Over the next weeks, something shifted. Margaret started calling before visiting, instead of just showing up. Janet brought actual gifts instead of empty gestures. Robert, surprisingly, was the holdout, still bitter about losing what he'd considered his inheritance. But when little David smiled for the first time, reaching toward his uncle with tiny fists, even Robert's resolve cracked. "He's got the Watson smile," Robert admitted grudgingly, letting the baby grip his finger. The legal victory had been complete. The family's challenge had cost them nearly $2 million in legal fees, paid from their conditional inheritances. Robert's business had collapsed entirely. Janet had lost her house. Margaret had been forced to move to a modest apartment, but they'd kept their family connections barely. "I want to apologize," Margaret said one afternoon while I was feeding the baby, "for everything. For not accepting you, for fighting the will, for being so cruel when you were grieving." I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation. Instead, I saw an old woman who'd lost her son, and nearly lost her grandson too. "David forgave you before he died," I said finally. He wouldn't have left you anything if he hadn't hoped you'd change. She nodded, tears falling onto my son's blanket. We almost lost him too. We almost lost everything that mattered. Outside, snow continued falling on the house David had bought for us, the house where his son would grow up, knowing his father's love through every provision, every protection, every careful plan. The birth certificate in my hands read, David, James Watson, and I knew that whatever happened with his extended family, this little boy would always know he was loved unconditionally. That was David's greatest gift, not the money, but the knowledge that family was about love, not blood. His son would never doubt where he belonged. 1 year later, I stood in the nursery David never got to see, watching our son take his first wobbly steps toward his grandmother's outstretched arms. Margaret had become a different person, softer, humbler, genuinely loving. She came over twice a week to help with the baby, never demanding but always available. Janet had found a job and a small apartment nearby, slowly rebuilding her life while staying close to her nephew. Robert had surprised everyone by being the most devoted uncle, perhaps because he understood better than anyone what it meant to lose everything and find your way back. The Olivia Watson Foundation had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. We'd funded scholarships for single mothers, supported domestic violence shelters, and helped families facing medical bankruptcies. David's money was making the world better, just as he dreamed. Mama, little David said, his first clear word, and my heart soared. On my desk sat a framed photo, the three of us together, taken just weeks before David's death. He had his hand on my belly, both of us laughing at something silly he'd said. We looked so young, so full of hope for the future we thought we'd have together. But as I watched our son toddle around the room, surrounded by grandparents and aunt, and uncle who now loved him unconditionally, I realized David had given us that future after all. Just not the way we'd planned. The doorbell rang and Margaret went to answer it. She returned with a young woman about my age, visibly pregnant, and clearly distressed. This is Sarah, Margaret said gently. She's in a situation similar to yours, lost her husband. Family not supportive, nowhere to turn. I looked at this frightened girl and saw myself 2 years ago. Lost, alone, dismissed by people who should have loved her. Would you like some tea? I asked, and watched relief flood her face. Later that evening, after Sarah had left with resources and hope, I sat rocking my son while he drifted off to sleep. Through the window, I could see Margaret's car still in the driveway. She'd stayed late to help with dinner, something that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Your daddy would be so proud, I whispered to the sleeping baby. He wanted to teach them about love, and look what happened. David had been right about everything. Love was stronger than blood. Family was about choice. And sometimes, the greatest gifts came disguised as the greatest losses. I was no longer just a pregnant widow with nothing. I was a mother, a philanthropist, a woman who'd learned that true wealth wasn't in bank accounts, but in the people who chose to love you. And I was finally, completely, home.